Yes.
Good morning and welcome to another Sunday morning story brought to you by Youngish. This morning I'd like to introduce Lord Lawrence Collins, a member of our shul for over 30 years. He'll take us on his journey from Cricklewood to the Supreme Court. After that, David Joseph QC will chat to Lawrence about his career, and we'll conclude with a Q&A open to you all, so then you can unmute yourself to ask your questions. Over to you, Lawrence.
I have to say that I'm a little envious of some of the previous speakers. We've had Simon Hockhauser, who comes from English Jewish aristocracy, and Edwina Grudzinski, who comes from Jewish aristocracy in India. I was born in slightly more humble conditions in Cricklewood in 1941, in the last week of the Blitz. And this is me, I don't know if that can be seen, at around that time. My mother's parents came from Eastern Poland, and they are the ones in the middle with my mother on the extreme top right. And then this is a picture of my grandmother meeting her relatives in Poland in 1938, all of whom, of course, perished in the war. These two here were killed by Poles, the rest were in the concentration camps. And I have a cousin called Ronnie Lerner in Israel, who made a very fine documentary called Lerner's Revenge about going to find the last surviving murderer of his grandparents. My father was a commercial traveler, and my mother had been a secretary. I still go to see Death of a Salesman whenever I can, although it brings back very, very sad memories because it's an incredibly accurate portrayal of what life is like for somebody on the road all the time, coming back on a Friday evening to say whether he'd earned a decent commission during the week. And that was my father's life. I'm sure that was what encouraged them to give me an education and what led me to seek an education. Jewish life in Cricklewood revolved around Cricklewood Synagogue. Willesden Synagogue was the synagogue we didn't go to. That was called Heathfield Park in those days. Now part of it is called Bronsbury Synagogue, and that's the synagogue which Baruch and Kezi Levine have revitalized. The rabbi of Cricklewood Synagogue was the charismatic Rabbi Morris Landy, one of the famous Landys. He bore an astonishing resemblance to Renaissance paintings of Jesus, with the consequence that when he went to visit Jewish patients in hospital, the non-Jewish patients thought that this was the second coming. My father later became, when he retired, life president of Cricklewood Synagogue, and he was the sort of Cecil White of Cricklewood, a kind, generous person without any real learning, but loved by the community. My parents sent me to the City of London school, the only other school at that time that Jewish boys in Cricklewood went to, I think, was Kilburn Grammar, although maybe some went to haberdashers. City of London at that time had a 10% quota for Jewish boys. We didn't think of that as discrimination. We thought of that as rather generous. And there were some quite distinguished Jewish boys at City of London. Among the head Jewish boys in my time were Brian Lapping, who became a famous documentary producer, Sir Francis Jacobs, who became Advocate General at the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, and Lord Leicester of Herne Hill, the prominent Social Democrat. Oddly enough, none of those afterwards had any kind of real Jewish life. Must be a reason for that. Among my contemporaries were Michael Brearley, the cricket captain of England, John Shrapnel, the well-known character actor who died recently, Lord Levine of Portsoken, the prominent businessman, and Michael Apted, the director of 7-Up and so on. I didn't enjoy school much in the early days. I spent most of my time getting out of playing sport, but in the sixth form, I think I blossomed under some charismatic teachers who encouraged me to seek to go to Oxbridge. And eventually I got into Downing College, Cambridge, not one of the most fashionable colleges. Among its alumni were George Blake, the notorious spy who escaped from Brixton prison, and Nick Griffin, the president of the BNP, the famous fascist. Among my contemporaries I wish I could show you this picture, but I think I'll ruin everything, the whole system, because I haven't had proper lessons from Ryan yet, were John Cleese, who I knew at that time quite well, Trevor Nunn, the famous theatre director, and Michael Apted, whom I known at school. I didn't have much of a Jewish life in Cambridge, apart from Friday nights at the Jewish Society. I spent most of my time, apart from work, running the university jazz club. But it was at Cambridge that I came across the first of my 3 main mentors. There was a very exceptionally intelligent and very difficult international law professor called Clive Parry. And at that time, I didn't know really how my career should progress. I wasn't sure whether I should be an academic or a solicitor. I didn't think of becoming a barrister because I thought, quite wrongly, that in order to be a successful barrister, you had to be a good advocate. I know better now. So eventually I decided to become a solicitor specializing in international law. And Clive Parry told me that there was only one place I should go to, and that was the firm of Francis Mann, who was a famous lawyer. He was a German emigre. He'd come with his wife in 1933 after professional life for Jews had become intolerable, and they got out very early, and he developed a practice in London. I'm looking at a wonderful picture of Brian Shyman now. Now it's changed. I formed a very close personal and professional relationship with Francis Mann, highly intelligent person with very intelligent children. One of his daughters, in fact, his only surviving child, is called Nicola Bowman. She founded a publishing house called Persephone Books, which publishes very finely produced books by women authors, and has a very nice shop in Lamb's Conduit Street. Francis Mann encouraged me not only in my practice, but also to develop the academic side of my career. And out of the blue, after I'd published a few articles, I had a letter from Dr. John Morris, an academic in Oxford, who was the author of, or editor of, a book called Dicey and Morris on the Conflict of Laws, which was the leading book on that subject in the Commonwealth. And I still have his letter framed on my wall, and it said, come to tea, but there may be more in it for you than just a friendly chat. And he invited me to become one of the editors of this book. And years later, I was invited to be the general editor of the book. This is just one of the volumes. It's now in its 15th edition. And once, if ever, the fate of Brexit will be decided, we will produce a new edition, because a lot of it is European law, and the whole subject is in a complete mess at the moment. So I developed my practice, and in 1996 or so, I met in the street a judge with whom I'd had a close professional relationship, Sir Michael Carr. Now, he was spelled Kerr. He'd always given the impression that he was from the Scottish nobility, at least. Certainly didn't give any impression otherwise. But in fact, his real name was Carr, but it was not pronounced Carr, it was pronounced Kerr, Kerr. And he was born in Germany, the son of Alfred Kerr, the famous Berlin drama critic, and the brother of Judith Kerr, the author of When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit. Anyway, he said to me, Lawrence, have you noticed that in the advertisement for applications for QC in the Times today, it's no longer limited to barristers, and solicitors can apply. So I took that up and applied, and eventually I was appointed with one other person. We were the first two practicing solicitors to have been appointed QC. And as a result, I got some rather interesting cases, the most important of which was the Pinochet case in the House of Lords, which was an introduction from Charles Corman. I don't know if he's online today. I had the great honor, and it was a terrifying experience, but it went all right, I think, of appearing before the House of Lords, a seven-person tribunal in a huge committee room full of press. And of course, it's a long story. We lost inevitably, but it was the greatest experience of my professional life. Around the same time, Lord Irvine, the Lord Chancellor, asked me to become a Deputy High Court Judge in the Chancery Division. I took that up. That was really going to be on the basis that if I liked the job and they liked me, I would get a full-time appointment, which I did in year 2000. I spent 5 or 6 years, happy years in the Chancery Division until I was promoted to the Court of Appeal. And then a couple of years later, I was appointed to the House of Lords Appellate Committee. I'm not sure if you can see that. That is the then members. The president was Lord Phillips of Worth Travers, who belatedly revealed that he, to the public, that he was from a Sephardi Egyptian background. And it is rumored, I don't know if it's true, that his mother was the inspiration for Justine in the Lawrence Durrell book. The House of Lords, just a few months later, morphed into the new UK Supreme Court, and I joined them there. Just one or two photographs from that period. This is my son with me in my House of Lords robes on my appointment. Son Aaron, he's now married to Jackie, and they may or may not be watching. This is me with my daughter Hannah, and she may or may not be watching with her fiance Mike. That's my late sister Hazel. And this is my lovely wife Patty, who I think is watching. Hope so. And this is me being introduced by Lord Hoffman and Lord Irvine. So I spent 2 interesting years in the Supreme Court, and I had to retire at the age of 70. But I believe in working till one drops. And since then, I've been a non-permanent member of the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal, where I've been going every year or 18 months for a month. I'm continue to teach until recently at New York University, and I'll continue a bit at University College London. and I have a fairly busy life as an international arbitrator. Otherwise, I've got really not much to do, and I don't hugely like talking about myself, but that's the story of my life.
Thank you, Lawrence. Thank you
so much. I know that people will want to have some time for questions, but I just wanted to maybe provide something, perhaps even a framework for some of the questions that people might ask. And so the thing I wanted to ask you is Lord Lloyd of Hampstead and Baroness Hale of the whole of Richmond. But can you tell us a bit about how you chose your title of Lord Lawrence of Mapesbury?
Well, yes, it came about, Lord Collins of Mapesbury, it comes about in the following way. There is a rule that if you have the same surname as either a living or dead peer, you have to describe yourself as of something. And there had been, in fact, the Master of the Rolls in the early, very early 20th century was Lord Collins, Master of the Rolls. So I had to choose a name. Unlike most of my colleagues who are a bit nouveau riche and have country homes, Lord Newburgh of Abbotsbury and Lord Brown of Eton under Haywood and so on, we don't have a country home. And I thought that, like some, I would try and identify a bit with where I was brought up. But Patty told me that I could not call myself Lord Collins of Cricklewood because Alan Corran had made a complete joke name of it, just as Private Eye had made the adjoining area, Neasden, a total joke. So I looked around on the map and I discovered that the street in which I'd been born and brought up was in the Mapesbury ward, on the what estate agents call the Mapesbury estate. Now, this is not a proper gazetted place, but to the rather drunken and anti-Semitic Garter King of Arms, it sounded right, and I think he didn't check it, and so I became Lord Collins of Mapesbury.
And your coat of arms?
I have not taken up a coat of arms, but I do have a lance, and I've agreed with Brian that we're going to joust on horses.
Quite right too.
I have a related question, actually. May I?
Lawrence, we'll do the questions at the end, if that's okay, yeah?
Sure.
So, Lawrence, you told us about joining the community 30 years ago, and I just tell us a bit about what brought you to us, as it were. I mean, we've all got our journeys on the way to South Hampstead, but tell us a bit about why you joined.
Well, it's not the usual journey. When my former wife Sarah and I moved to Hampstead, the only synagogue we'd heard of was what was called Hampstead Synagogue, Dennington Park Road. And so one Sunday, I went to sign up, and in there was one of the wardens. I thought, you know, I've seen that person somewhere else. Can't think where, just could not think where. Anyway, it was fairly near Rosh Hashanah, and I'm a Cohen. So I went up to Dochen for the priestly blessing, and there were only two other Kohanim there. One was this warden whom I could not remember where I'd seen him, and the other was his son, whom, of course, I immediately realized I was suing on behalf of a client, and the warden was the senior partner of the same firm. So I thought this could not continue. And then we looked around and found out that there was, in fact, another synagogue in Hampstead, and I was then one of the people working in my team was Trevor Assison, whom many of you will remember and know. And he said, why don't you come along with me and we will go to Southampton together. And I went, and there were, I think, not more than 20 people there on Shabbos. Shlomo had only just joined, I think, presumably in the last months or possibly a year. And it was only just beginning to grow. And of course, it's never looked back.
Well, I mean, talking about community of 20, we're sort of harking back to sort of pre-COVID times, you see. That would be perfect now, to have 20 people in distant corners of a room. Obviously, Lawrence, you had the most extraordinary judicial career and as well as academic career. But I think it'd be really interesting for people on this Zoom call just to hear something about the judicial decision-making process. I mean, obviously, as an advocate, you'd like to think it's all to do with your sparkling advocacy and that one little argument wins the day. But behind the scenes, perhaps we could just draw the curtain behind the scenes a little bit as to what happens in that famous room of 5 or even 7, as you described in Pinochet.
Well, I'll start at the beginning. I think at first instance and in the Court of Appeal, one is usually concerned to do justice. And otherwise, in exceptional circumstances, generally it's possible to work out who are the good guys and who are the bad guys and decide accordingly. And most cases in the end actually answer themselves, although they occasionally have difficulties. And of course, there are, in family law, where there are no good guys and no bad guys, I think it's extremely difficult. And I only had connection with family law when I was in the Court of Appeal. And I realized that among the most difficult cases are custody cases and things like that. Once you get to the highest court, it's more difficult because you are making rulings which you can't really afford just to decide who are the good guys and who are the bad guys because of the precedential effect of what you do. And so it's much more difficult. The actual decision-making is really, at least in my time, I think things have changed. There isn't much discussion in the Supreme Court prior to the case. There isn't a lot of discussion about the case during the case. The idea being to avoid influencing one's colleagues too much with one's own views so that you all have an independent view. Then after the hearing, usually on the same day, but usually it's better if it's the next day, but it rarely is, there is a roundtable discussion where the most junior of the judges gives his or her view, and then it goes all the way around. And for a newly appointed judge, that's a rather terrifying experience. I remember giving my view and hearing some muttering from down the end of the room from the absolutely brilliant Judge Lord Roger of Earls Ferry, wondering what on earth I'd done wrong. But that's the system. And then eventually, if there's a consensus, the presiding judge allocates somebody to write the main judgment and takes it from there.
And I mean, do you think that, I mean, just to sort of bring this right forward, do you think that system that you have described, can that, as it were, survive properly through remote hearings? It is something that worries me a little bit because there's an immediacy, isn't there, of actually being in the same room as everyone for an exchange of ideas, a proper flow of ideas. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that.
I think it will change things. It'll change, there won't be any collegiality if it continues for long. In a way, it may increase the independence of thought, where there isn't the opportunity to chat in the same way. On the other hand, I suppose that they will be telephoning each other after the hearing to discuss matters. And so things may not change a lot.
Yeah, that's interesting. So an associated question, which has always intrigued me, and you've also in your introductory remarks mentioned one or two very, very outstanding and famous Jewish judges sitting in our courts. So it's almost a philosophical question. What influence, if any, do you think your sort of Jewish values have had in your role as a judge? I mean, if any.
Well, I think I values, yes. I think request for justice is something probably most judges have actually, but I'm sure I'm influenced by that. I'm probably also influenced by the pernickety obscurantism of Talmudic discourse. And certainly my attention to detail probably comes from that, obsessive attention to detail.
Yeah, no, that's well. That certainly comes out of the two volumes of your great work. for those on this call who are not familiar with Dicey Morris and Collins, it is just the most extraordinary. Well, it is the most extraordinary textbook of all time. In fact, in our world, and the respect that it has. Right across the common law, it is completely extraordinary. And very often, when I appear in courts, you're in the middle of a sentence, and the judge just stops you. He says, "Well, what does Dicey Morris and Collins say about this?" And if you actually try to argue, for example, that Lawrence has got it wrong, you're having a bad day in court. That's not always a good thing to have that not on your side. Lawrence, I was going to ask you a light-hearted question, and then we'll probably throw it open to the floor. But you mentioned the love of jazz, which developed when you were in Cambridge, and I know from speaking to you when you sort of pop into my room and we chat and everything, that great love of jazz has continued right through your life. And when you go and teach in New York, one of the highlights for you is the jazz clubs that you're able to see. Perhaps, and there are some people on this call who don't know this, but Lawrence and Patty are fine swing dancers. And I know this for a fact because I was invited to a swing dance at UCS school. And there we saw Lawrence and Patty just sort of, twirling and swirling all night long. But for those on this call, would you be able to tell us something about the jazz scene in New York, and because it's just so much more vibrant, really, than anything that we have in London?
Well, it's a very long story. I think I'd better be short on that, which is that, that there are at least, whereas there are only basically 2 or 3 clubs here, very rarely having top players. In New York, there are 10 or 12 where you can go every night to see someone that jazz maniacs like me would like to see. Yeah. My love of jazz started actually when I was at school. I was secretary of the City of London School Jazz Club, one of my greatest achievements.
And your instrument?
None.
Well, that is the greatest achievement then.
No, actually my greatest achievement is to have moved up the social scale from NW2 to NW3.
Yeah, quite right.
But I think the greatest thing, one of the greatest things that's happened, there are a few great things happened to me. Firstly, of course, having my lovely children and meeting Patty, and also coming into this wonderful community, which Shlomo and Lindy have done so much to develop and cherish.
Well, I think we all recognize and share that. And I think even in these difficult times, the extent to which this community has been able to pull together and support one another has been certainly one of the highlights for me, to see how much it has been able to influence and help and protect people's lives. I thought that's enough of my questions, and wanted to throw this open. Who's going to sort of moderate now? Because we need someone to introduce and all the other questioners and so on.
I will.
Lovely. Thank you, Gillian.
If you've got a question, can you unmute yourself?
I've got a question.
Brian, you have a question. Go ahead.
I'll follow.
Lawrence, you're looking unprofitably well, if I may say so, or you will when you've had a haircut, and Norman. But anyway, look, I've been struggling. I've asked you this before, but I can't remember the answer. It's about a form of address for, you know, if I were to send you, for an example, an account or, God forbid, a statement. What is the correct form of address?
Which was
It's terribly pretentious. I never use it, but it is the right on, the Lord Collins of Mapesbury.
Right on.
The right on, the.
Any other question?
Yes, may I ask? Hello, David, and delighted to have Lord Collins to talk. I was going to ask him if he could explain perhaps a little bit more about what conflict of law is. I do have a vague idea because I did study law at University of Cape Town, but that was a long time ago, and I've forgotten most of what I did learn, if anything. And secondly, did he meet any of the most famous judges like Lord Denning, who did visit Cape Town University when I was there? And of course, Lord Hoffman, he's mentioned, who is a South African. So I'd be interested to hear any anecdotes about them.
Firstly, conflict of laws it's the subject which tells courts or practitioners or individuals in rare cases what law is to apply in an international context. For example, the simplest example, that's not in my field, is if a marriage is performed in accordance with the correct form in France, but it's not the correct form in England, will the marriage be recognized in England? And the answer is questions of formalities of marriage depend on the place where the marriage is contracted, and therefore the marriage would be valid. That's a very, very simple example. So it deals with how you deal with what law is to apply in international situations, and it can be, or which courts are going to have jurisdiction in international situations. So it's a fascinating area, a little bit recherche, but increasingly important with globalization. And that's why, in fact, the subject has really mushroomed incredibly in the last 30 or 40 years. As far as the second thing is, yes, I met most of the relevant judges. I'm not sure I'm going to give go in for anecdotes in this public setting. Lord Denning was immensely charming and very, very able, intellectually a little bit dishonest in getting the answers he wanted to get to. Lord Hoffman is incredibly brilliant and charming, lives in Keats Grove. You may have seen him cycling around. Yes, certainly of South African origin, like many of our greatest judges, like Lord Steyn and Lord Scott and others. An extraordinarily brilliant person who's still active in international arbitration at the age of 86.
Gosh. And how about Pinochet? How was it meeting him? And what did he tell?
I never met him. I acted for the government of Chile, not for General Pinochet. I asked the clients from the embassy what he was like, and they said, well, actually, he's completely out of it. That was right at the beginning, which suggested to me that it was actually true, although the contrary has been said, that he wasn't actually capable of eventually standing trial when he went back to Chile.
Thank you.
Put your hand up if you've got a question, please. The battery's low, Andrew. Not so bad.
Lawrence, it's Edward here. Morning again. Can I ask you what anti-Semitism or pro-Semitism you may have experienced throughout your career?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and I've thought about it quite a lot. I think, given where I've got to, I don't think you can say there's any institutional anti-Semitism in this country at all. However, over the years, I've met like I'm sure most of us here, low-level anti-Semitism. Really low level. Well, I was called Jew boy in the streets in Cricklewood. I went to a meeting at Rothschild's where they were discussing, Rothschild's of all places, where they were discussing a prospectus, and the company secretary said, oh, we better put down the chairman's CBE just to show he's not a Jew boy just off the boat from Russia. And a famous QC was chatting to another famous QC in court and said, oh, I've got a tax case on next week, Jones against Goldberg. And the other one said, oh, I don't suppose Jones is the taxpayer. And that's the kind of low level, and it's not, and before the Holocaust, that would be not a lot more serious than jokes about mean Scots. It's really only the Holocaust that's given it made it really unacceptable. But I think I can honestly say, oh, the other thing is, a good American lawyer friend of mine, not Jewish, said to me, you'd be amazed at what's said about Jews in dinner parties when there are no Jews present. But most of the anti-Semitism I've come across is not much more than snobbery.
Norman, I think you had a question. Can you unmute?
Yes, I've just unmuted. Right. Lawrence, good morning. And I'm sorry to hear you downplay your musical skills, because of course you are a virtuoso of the recorded catalogue, and you and I are probably the last two of those left. But I wanted to ask you this: the particular influence that you have from Francis Mann, was there a different kind of rigor that was applied to the German legal mind than that which you experienced in the British legal mind?
I can honestly say I have never come across a lawyer with greater analytic skills and imagination than Francis Mann. He was, because he combined practice and academic work, he had a unique insight into the logic and the justice behind law. And I've certainly never come across even some of the greatest judges that I've come across, Lord Hoffman or Lord Roger, just did not have that. I thought he was a totally remarkable person. I must say, I can tell an anecdote about him. He did have extraordinary academic rigor, which got in the way of any other niceties. And in the 1970s, 1980s, when I was a fellow of Wolfson College, Cambridge, I used to get visitors from London to speak to the students. And after each speech, after each talk, I used to ask for questions. And as is well known, English audiences are sometimes a bit reticent about asking questions. So I would always plant one of my students to ask the first question, which would then break the ice. And I had this very, very good student who subsequently became head of legal services in the European Council in Luxembourg, or in Brussels. After I'd say, it was a very fine speech, applause, applause, applause. I'm sure there are lots of questions, and my student would put up his hand. Eventually, Francis Mann came to give a talk, and I said, very, very good. I'm sure there will be lots of questions. So my student, who was working on field in Francis Mann's, got up very nervously to ask his question, which he did. Francis Mann said, "I'm sorry, I simply do not understand that question." There were no further questions.
I have a question, Lawrence. How often do you get into the House of Lords? How often do you sit?
I've not been at all active. I got engrossed in international arbitration and teaching almost immediately after I left the Supreme Court, and I continued to sit on a temporary basis until I was 75. And after that, I continued. And so I do go in, but I'm not at all active.
Do you have a view on Jenny Tong?
Oh, she's awful.
Okay.
Allow me to share my correspondence with Jenny Tong with you one day. It is fascinating.
I do allow it.
Any other questions?
Julian?
Yes.
Yeah, Lawrence, very well, good morning. I believe you were very involved in the JFS policy. Did you find that difficult on a personal level?
In fact, I wasn't involved, and the story really is this. The deputy president didn't pick me for the panel and told me that he thought I would be embarrassed by that, by being on the panel. Now, that was very odd, said, and I'm not sure quite how he knew I was Jewish anyway. He may have had gaydar. But I wouldn't have been able to sit on it in any event because the United Synagogue was a party to it, and I'd been a lifelong member of the United Synagogue, so I would have been disqualified from sitting on it in any event. It was a wrong decision, in my view. The dissents, particularly by Lord Roger, my idol, were totally compelling. And I've got my own theories as to why the court went the way it did.
Thank you.
Got a question. I've got a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Lawrence, it was really, really interesting listening to you. Absolutely fascinating. A lot more hidden gems or too modest to talk about. But the question I've got, all your associates are males, Lord this, Lord that. Women judges aren't there. You know the percentage of women judges as against men, along with men judges. Can you answer the question first?
I'm not sure, I didn't hear all of that, Marilyn, but I've got the gist of it, I think. The problem with the recruitment of women judges is that in the past, judges were almost always recruited from the ranks of the most successful barristers. And for all sorts of reasons, discrimination, lifestyle, it was very difficult for women to reach the top of the bar. Now that has changed a bit, but not wholly. There were, for a short time, 3 women judges in the Supreme Court. There are now 2. I don't know the numbers in the Court of Appeal, but it's probably quite a bit less than 50%. In the High Court, it's probably around 20%. It is increasing. Eventually, it will be 50%, but at least, but for the moment, it's a slow and long haul. I mean, Brenda Hale, the president of the, was one of the pictures I was hoping to show you. She's on this, I think, anyway. Let me just see. And there she is at the back.
Right.
She is very, very fine, and has, of course, got a lot of publicity over the Brexit cases. But she was a trailblazer, and she's terrific.
Well, answer me the second part of my question, which I haven't given you yet. Why has it been so difficult for women to reach the pinnacle of their career and to be made judges?
Again, that's the whole structure of the bar and the way the clerking system works. It's quite, the barristers' clerks don't like someone who is going to go off once they've established a practice and then go off on maternity leave for a month or a year. And there just inbuilt difficulty at the bar, being individual practitioners, from a successful career at the bar. Just it's institutional. It's not the same in solicitors' professions. I think in many firms there are 50% women partners. My firm was one of the pioneers in this, and that it just is at the moment the fact of life.
Is there no way?
Sorry, it's very invidious to me to give a dissenting judgment here. I'm not sure that the restrictions come from what happens in the clerk's room. I think that there are structural difficulties in the profession which we are desperately trying to address. But the hours that are involved in court work are just horrendous, frankly. And judges keep on demanding that answers be given overnight and so on and so forth. I mean, which would involve several hours of work. And there are many people who find the structure of the bar difficult to combine with family life. And so we are hearing again and again that women are being put off from even coming to the bar in the numbers that would generate the kind of 50-50 split that Lawrence is talking about. And so if you look at our chambers, at the bottom end, we have 50-50 women. Now we have 50-50 women at the bottom end, but anything above, let's say 5-6 years we do not have 50-50 women at all. And so it's a slow process to persuade women to come to the bar, basically.
Pamela. Unmute. Can you unmute yourself? Can't hear you, Pamela. Pamela? Yes, now. Yeah, try again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, I have the loudspeaker on now. Lawrence, thank you very much. I did have a question, but I think I ought to come in on the last question Marilyn asked. I do agree with Lawrence that the...
Pamela, you've gone off again. You've gone off again.
I think everybody should be apart from Pamela.
And there again?
Yes.
Okay. I'm a member of the criminal bar, and I do agree with Lawrence that clerking has a lot to do with choice of who goes to work. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I also, when I first started, which was some time ago, I was asked if I was going to go off and have a baby. But I don't think those sort of questions are asked now because we have diversity and equality. But there is a system of clerking where the clerks do allocate work. And I do think that there is, or there has been, a tendency for the male bar to progress on different kind of cases. So the women might be channeled into more sex or domestic, and the men might do the guns and the drugs. I mean, that isn't always the case, and I haven't found it personally with me so much. But I do, there are hours of work, and I think that women are as prepared as men to put those hours in. So I don't think that's necessarily a difference. Of course, the problems with the bar, there are long hours, and you are expected to produce much more than we used to, written arguments. And I agree totally with David at that there's a lot of pressures at the bar. As far as the criminal bar is concerned, we are faced with legal aid issues as well, which are very poor. But so if I can just answer those questions posed by Marilyn, that it has been a very much pro-male profession. Coming to my other question, I wanted to ask Lawrence, if I might, about the Court of Appeal Criminal Division, or about the Court of Appeal, is how much, how is the work allocated between the justices of the Court of Appeal, between civil or criminal work? And is there a difference in your view in deciding a criminal case as it might be to a civil chancery decision in the Court of Appeal, civil or criminal decisions. So those are questions I had in relation to the criminal and civil part of the Court of Appeal.
I'm sorry, I can't help Pamela on that because I have no experience of the criminal side at all. And I know how the civil cases are allocated, but I can't help on the crime.
It seems to be now that the selection, there's far more shipping and commercial practitioners becoming Court of Appeal criminal decision in the Court of Appeal. So I just wondered if there was a different channeling.
I'm sorry, I can't help.
Lindy, did you have a question?
I do. I do. I'm unmuted. Lawrence, thank you for your deep wisdom. Whatever you say is so layered and so deep. And thank you for sharing your knowledge and your experience with us. Polonius to Laertes offered one wise word of advice. This above all, to your own self be true, and it shall follow as the night the day. You cannot then be false to any man. Could you be our Polonius, and we your Laertes, and you give us the one piece of advice to your profession going forward? What would that be?
Wow, that's hard. At the moment, I think the greatest challenge facing the profession is the enormous cost to ordinary citizens. And ordinary citizens can no longer afford to go to law or seek good legal advice. So I think all I can say is that we must find a way to enable ordinary people to get proper advice and to obtain justice.
Can I thank Lawrence very much for your chat today? We've really enjoyed it. And thank you, David, for your help.
I'd just like to add my thanks, Lawrence. Your talk was wonderful. I learned a lot about the judges and your career and Cricklewood and Mapesbury. So thank you so much for that. It was wonderful to listen to.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.